Hello, and welcome everyone to this exciting episode of Book Club in a World. In today's discussion, we will have the privilege of conversing with keepers and fellow podcasters about the captivating subject of world building. Throughout this episode, we will explore various questions related to world building, uncovering invaluable tips and tricks to empower you, our cherished listeners, to embark on your own adventures with confidence. Let's begin with introductions, who you are, the pods you're associated with, and a brief statement as to why you enjoy participating in this actual play genre. And Jonny, do you want to start off?
Why not? I'm Jonny Grubb. I am associated with this podcast. I'm the keeper of the Monsters Playbook and our current campaign, The Cover Story. As far as why I like participating in this creative genre of actual play games, I really like the intersection between me making stuff up and getting surprised by what the players come up with. This idea that we get to tell stories and tell lies together.
Hello, my name is David Easley. I'm a host, showrunner, producer, etc. for a podcast called Trials of the Apocalypse, where we do one-shot stories in different Powered by the Apocalypse games. And I'm also guested on a plethora of other shows. You may have heard me from somewhere else instead, such as this moment here on this one. And I am a fan of the creative genre of actual play games. Kind of similar to Jonny, I adore collaborative storytelling. And I think that actual play is one of the most accessible forms of that. And being able to do that with other people is kind of the best part for me.
Hey everyone, I'm Quinn. I am the keeper / GM and producer of Monster Hour, Monster of the Week, and Absurdia actual play podcast. The reason that I really love actual plays as a genre, similar to Jonny and David said, this notion of coming together with like you and your players and co-creating a story together where no one knows what's going to happen. No one knows what's going to happen next. We're all figuring it out together. And the amazing stories that we wind up telling through that process is just it's a type of fiction that doesn't really exist anywhere else, as far as I can tell, and I love it.
Hello, adventurers. I'm Natalie. I'm the keeper, producer, editor over on the Storyteller Squad. And you can also find me on The Writer's Room, where I'm part of the mini-series that we did over there called The Fate of the Thorn, where I'm the captain of a bunch of gay pirates. And I think that answers why I like this genre of storytelling. Echoing what everybody's said already, but also I really like how there's a lot of room, especially within this niche of actual play, for representation and adapting existing myths and story genres so that they fit your sensibilities and like the sorts of narratives that you enjoy, because we don't get a lot of that in mainstream media. And so we got to do it ourselves.
Now let's dive into the questions and we'll get the discussion rolling. So here's the plan. I'll pose the questions and then it's open floor for everyone to share their thoughts. Let's keep it organic and make sure that everyone respects everyone's opportunity to voice their experiences. Does that sound good?
No table talk.
Yes.
I got nothing but respect.
Here we go. First question. What inspires the worlds you create?
Now we're all afraid to go first.
I have prepared answers because that's kind of nerd I am. Everything. Absolutely everything. For me, it's lived experiences and the media I consume and the research I do. It's all part of this like strange library mess in my brain.
Just kind of all the inputs coming in all at once.
Yeah, specifically what I use for Monster of the Week. Aesthetically, I pull a lot of influence from like Hellboy and Constantine. And like, I wish there were more movies with that aesthetic of like practical effects and monsters and, detectives and people and everything. And American Gods and like Good Omens scratch a lot of the sort of irreverent cosmology that I like to pull into my stories. I never watched any of the like classic Monster of the Week shows like Buffy or Angel or anything like that. So I'm like missing that pocket of inspiration, I think. So I have like a very uniquely Buffy-less energy to the stories I tell. Not to knock it at all. It's just, it's been, it's old TV now and I have so many other things to catch up on. So I don't have it. But Ghibli films and like the wonder and playfulness that they bring. And I'm a recovering weeaboo. So a lot of like anime and the sort of slice of life vibes that can bring, as well as like very over the top shonen energy and like cutesy shoujo stuff. So I don't even know if people use those terms anymore. It's just how old of an anime nerd I am.
It can't be helped.
Yeah, it's too late for me.
No, that's great. But yeah, really bringing a unique perspective into the genre through all those different channels. So that's awesome.
Yeah, you got to use everything because otherwise, I don't know. What else do you got?
I'll hop on and also confess that I have not seen Buffy and start that up.
Oh, no.
You guys, weekend project. Come on.
I saw the movie. Does that count?
We're going to be discredited.
I know, exposed as frauds. I would echo Natalie, like everything. Every aspect of my life kind of goes into the worlds that I create and where I get ideas. I'll have, just a thought that I can't get out of my head, and the only way to sort of get through it is to enter it into the actual play space. I almost said as part of the first question, I'll say it now, the reason I love actual play, and I think the reason I love being, a game master or keeper or whatever you want to call it, is that I'm a writer who can't write. I can't write for prolonged periods of time, like one would be required to write a novel, but I can write little bits just talking. It's so much easier than having to put pen to paper.
Oh, totally.
But yeah, the inspirations for, what goes into my worlds are, a lot of the media that I consume, whether that's, holistically, I love fantasy settings, love, the sort of monster of the week genre, and all sorts of media and literature that, both as a meta level goes into the types of actual plays that I like to create, and the worlds that I like to build, but also on a very sort of discrete individual level. If I'm thinking of a monster for a Monster of the Week mystery, or, a threat for some other game system, like, oh, well, there's this interesting thing that I, saw in a TV show or watched in a movie or, heard in my day job. How can I turn that into a monster? Right. And those things, those tend to populate my worlds pretty regularly.
Just kind of getting things from all those different channels is really powerful, and converting that into something that's usable it's great.
Is it too branching to talk less? Because I feel like we've covered the where does inspiration come from, which can be from literally any thought that strikes you. but I think for me, drawing that from that pool of inspiration to the actual world building, the connective tissue is just the worst kind of kleptomania. Like, specifically, I kind of think of world building like doing a collage of everything I've ever seen or read, but like the serial killer kind of collage, where like you don't like cut out the person, you cut out like a hand from this person and like the head from this one and the arm from this one, and you just kind of like
Frankenstein.
Yeah, you Frankenstein them together, and that's like the critical element in all kinds of thievery. What prevents it from being plagiarism and instead makes it inspiration is how many sources you take from at once. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like if you're a thief and you like rob one bank, like, yeah, they're going to catch you. But if you like insert some, malware that takes 1 cent from every account everywhere, I mean, the chance that they'll all notice, pretty low, right? So same principle applies.
Well, that's a perspective.
I'm just saying, if you're going to do crime, do it to everyone.
I endorse this perspective.
Yeah, if you put it another way, if you exploit the working hours and labor of the entire population so that you become a billionaire, you could really make away like a bandit.
What I'm saying is, if you're going to be a world builder, you got to have that billionaire mindset. You got to exploit everybody. You can't stop at just one. You got to go to all the sources.
Are we talking about world building anymore? Or?
Well, I'll see you next time, guys.
For legal reasons, yes.
Got it. Asking for a friend.
I have described that as opening up the junk drawer of my imagination. That especially when it gets into like, you have the like big things that you come into it with, but then even when we get into the minute descriptions, I have to borrow a lot from elsewhere to be like, oh, it's kind of like that thing from that other thing.
Yep.
But I think the more and more I thought about this whole concept, the more I was like, when we think about world building, especially in like a interactive fiction medium, I feel like there's kind of two worlds that you have to deal with. There's the world of like all the what's going on with the rules of magic and the mysteries and kind of things behind the scenes. But then there's just like the world that you have to like walk around in, that maybe there's normal people and maybe there's just like a cop and a librarian, giving people and players and myself enough hooks in all of those things to make the place feel lived in.
Well, and that, I mean, really kind of bridges us into the next question here. How much planning is required for world building and what's involved in that?
The shitty answer that comes to my mind immediately is
None.
Enough. How much planning should go into world building? There is no should. But I think, again, where I come from is enough to make it feel lived in, enough to make the world feel bigger than you are, that there's things going on, there's people walking around, to be able to, when there are questions like, is there someone around who might be able to blah, 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 being able to answer those.
Just to kind of add on to that, or maybe pose a different perspective, I would say how much planning is sort of necessary for world building is as much as you feel like, as much as you're comfortable with, and really as much as you and your players want within your setting. So, you take Johnny's example here, you have a player who says, is there somebody who can do X? How much of your world needs to be consistent that you need an answer for that planned ahead of time versus how much can you say, oh yeah, Beelzebub, the banker, can definitely do that for you. Is that can you off the top of your head make something up that is consistent if your world has, a lot of sort of rules and frameworks and existing infrastructure? Maybe you can't, maybe you need to plan that out. But, if you're able to do that off the top of your head, or if you can co-create that with your players, then it's really that level of planning is kind of up to you and the world that you want to make and are making.
I want to echo and sort of piggyback off of that, because I think you need as much as will allow you to run a fun game for you and your friends. And that's literally the only answer that ever matters. But it's going to be different for everyone, and it's going to change like as you play your game and continue to evolve as a GM and an improvisational storyteller. And it can change based on your mental health that month, or your energy level that week, or the morning you had. And it's just going to be specific based on the arc you're in the midst of with your story, or if it's a finale versus a session 1, or a one shot, or a mini series versus a long campaign. So I don't think there's like a correct amount, but the correct amount could be different from week to week based on what you need and what you're, feeling about where your story's headed and stuff. So I think you just don't want to let feeling underprepared stop you from playing, or being this like art block that stops you from being a GM, because you will always feel a little underprepared, and that's okay. Just try it, and you'll surprise yourself. And like we mentioned before, your players will surprise you too. And that's part of the magic of doing this. So.
Oh, I just want to springboard directly off of that "you'll always be underprepared" line, because first off, if there's one line you take away from this entire thing, to be honest, if there's one line, it should be "you will always be underprepared." I think my answer to this question is the amount of planning that should go into world building is however much you need to answer every question, regardless of whether you're prepared for it, confidently. Because whether it's completely off the cuff, whether it's just you've left that space of the world building open enough that you're comfortable either letting the players or letting yourself add that detail, but like whatever lets you be confident, that's all that you need. Because like at that point, you've done enough. Because if you're confident in it and somebody throws you a curveball, then you swing, and sometimes you swing and you miss, but like at least you know what you're swinging at. I think that, I don't know, we kind of crept through a couple of metaphors there, but.
We're building the metaphor as we go along.
Yeah, really, that whole explanation, this was my intent all along, of course. That whole explanation was just a metaphor for how you can world build on the fly and still get somewhere valuable with your world building.
You can't build a world without breaking a few eggs.
That's right. You can't build a world without a few awkward pauses.
There you go.
I mean, kind of the consensus here. I mean, it sounds like, yeah, really, it's the comfort level of when you feel like you've hit that threshold of I'm confident going into this. But then as far as the things that you introduced, Johnny, you had mentioned like creating this like living world. Is it easier to be able to generate ideas off of more kind of general items like that, or instead of having very specific things that you generate in the world that you want people to interact with? Is it better to aim for things that are more general in like, this is the general type of space, this is the general type of people that are in this area? Does that make it more flexible to be able to navigate?
I think the way I will answer that question is by refusing to answer it. No, I think so.
Beautiful. moving on.
Yeah, keeping things general can be helpful in that it will let you focus on the questions that actually need answering in advance. But I think like the thing about this as an interactive collaborative medium is that it helps to sort of get a sense from the players what things they want out of your world. Like I can come up with something that I think is very exciting, but if the players walk past it, then I needn't have bothered. All of the things that I'm trying to do when building a world for these games is to give hooks and levers for the players to pull on. So it helps if I can have them come in and then they start poking around and asking, what's over here? Who can we talk to? What's this kind of stuff? Because then that lets me know for sure that when I come up with whatever that thing is, it's going to be of use to them. It's going to be of interest to them. And it's going to build the world out in a way that they want.
Yeah, I was going to say too, I think it depends on your genre sometimes, or like, the tone you're trying to hit. If you're playing a very lighthearted and just sort of silly, fun Humblewood campaign, just to throw an example out there, right? You might not have to write as much specific things as if you were like, I'm going to write Candyland Game of Thrones, right? If you pull Crown of Candy in here as an example, it's like both of those games need a different amount of prep because of the type of story you're trying to tell. So I think, that can influence it a lot too. If you're playing Blades of the Dark and you have a heist that you want to pull off, well, you need to know at least enough about where you're going to send your players to figure out how things are going to unfold when they mess up their heist and have to backtrack and then recover and stuff. Versus if you're playing, what's another simple game? Honey Heist. Then like bears are going to get honey, and you probably don't have to worry too much about how or why that happens.
And I guess this has been touched on a little bit, but what elements should one consider venturing into world creation? We'll just start with that.
Natalie mentioned tone, and I think that's like tone and emotion are the two biggest cornerstones to me. That not only you, if you're the one who's running the story, that you need to be fully cognizant of and angling towards facilitating, but also you have to make sure that like you and the players are in agreement of what that tone is and what the emotions that are to be explored are. Because as Jonny said, like it's an interactive thing, and if the players are reaching for something that you're not giving to them because you have a mismatch, then your world is going to go in directions that neither of you expect, and also that might not be fun because it's not what you both had kind of subconsciously in that case agreed to, right? I think that if you know your tone and you know like the kinds of emotions you're trying to elicit, that's a really great starting place with then figuring out the details that will follow either of those two forcing functions.
I think what I have for this one as far as key elements to consider is, and we've touched on it already, is like an idea being unique isn't the only thing that's going to make it interesting. So if you have something and you're like, but this is just like that other thing from that other show, who gives a shit? Make it unique by interacting with it in an interesting way. Make it unique by just giving it a different name.
Put a twist on it.
Cut off more hands from your scrapbook and start pasting them on there.
Yeah.
It needs more hands.
Dig around in the junk drawer in your brain. Just add hands.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think everyone here, we've all played Monster of the Week, but we all have, which in and of itself is like a very derivative genre. Like it's played out, but it's great. Like it's a great genre. It doesn't have to be unique. I think, Monster Hour, I think is an extremely, how do I say this in not super deprecating way? I don't think it's extremely unique. Like, it hits all of the classic, tropes of, sinister monsters and found family and everything, but it's good. Like it doesn't have to be, and we've all hit like, different elements of the genre and we have different tones, but as long as like you and your players and your audience, if you're doing an actual play, as long as you're all, bought in on the tone and the setting, like it's going to be amazing.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I have like 3 things. I got to try and get them all out before I forget them all. Firstly, yes, the setting and the genre matter, and you have to know what you're excited about within that genre so that your excitement can translate into excitement for your players, right? If you're doing a Western, or no, let's not use that one. Let's do Space Western, okay? Space Western, way less appropriate. Space Westerns, if you really like the idea of bounty hunters, then make your story about that rather than, I don't know, magical space knights or whatever, figure out the thing within the broader category that you're really going to zero in on because it excites you and you think you'll be able to come up with lots of fun ideas for your players. Like if I was to try and run Absurdia, I guarantee I would find something about that genre of like absurdist humor / horror that would be completely different from what Quinn is, doing with their story. So yeah, and now my 2 other thoughts are gone, but it's okay.
Damn it.
that was a big important
I lost
one.
2 while I was talking too.
So in your guys' experience, I mean, with all this world building, what has been the most challenging aspect of world building? What are some hurdles you guys have gotten really stuck on? And
I think a really hard part, and this is like from a position of privilege in that you have ideas at all, but it can sometimes be hard to trim the fat and find the ones that are really good, that don't make the setting too busy or like trying to do too many things at once. Especially, I have at this point too much experience doing like short form actual play specifically. If I compare like how I started doing some world building for earlier games versus what I do now, I'm so much more cognizant now of what can fit into the time that I've allowed for it. And if it isn't the best of the best in those beats that I want to hit, then it doesn't make it in. I think that's true regardless of the scope of your story, that if you have a glut of ideas, especially if you're mining a genre or a theme that you're just like really excited about, you probably will. Doing a pass on your own thoughts on it where you're like, okay, but which one of these are like really good and like really go together, and like which ones of these are like fun, but maybe I'll save that for something else down the line. Maybe that'll be my bucket of hands to paste on just in case, right?
It's such an upsetting metaphor.
I love it.
Just this chimera monster being like,
I want to use that.
I'm making a monster of
also
the
a
week monster right
vampire.
now.
I want to use that for something.
It's only slightly less upsetting than the capitalism metaphor.
We're all going to have that monster in our next campaign.
Yeah. A bucket of hands.
Guaranteed.
But actually, no. Even if that was the case, I guarantee you, everyone here, we've shared the same seed concept for what this is. But I guarantee you, our implementation would be different, each one of us. And that's like on what Jonny said about like, who cares if it's been done before? If you put your own spin on it, if you start taping on your own bucket of hands to the hand monster, like it will turn out different. And that's world building, baby.
Quick, everybody pitch your bucket of hands monster.
I would watch this miniseries.
For me, I would say the most challenging element of world building comes about when you like play for a long period of time in the same setting. And trying to maintain, especially if you have, Jonny mentioned like systems of magic and you have sort of ongoing kind of developments within a world and you have multiple monsters and magical systems and people interacting, is trying to kind of keep all of that in your head or electronic or physical record that you can keep track of basically, and like not lose all of the threads.
I was going to say just kind of connecting everything.
Yeah, that gets, the longer you play in one setting, the more difficult that gets. I wish I had a great answer.
I have a great answer.
Oh, please. Yeah. Because my system of just keeping things in my brain and writing them down in documents that I lose is not great.
Well, yeah, that's what I do too. So maybe it's not the best answer, but I can actually speak from experience because I'm in the process of writing out a 3rd season in the same setting right now. A couple of things come up. Like, one, simplicity is sometimes your friend, because you have to remember that this is world building, but it's for a game that you have to improvise. And depending on your number of players, in my case, 6 characters, you have to be able to adapt and move things around and have things be flexible enough. So if you really try and get too deep into like a philosophical argument or like a theme you're trying to like really expose and like make a statement on, it can be hard sometimes to fit that on top of, okay, now roll to figure out what happens.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, if you wind up stuck and you're trying to make, like Quinn was saying, the existing pieces fit and connect and tie back to each other, you end up with this tangled mess. And the solve that I found sometimes is you need to either flesh something out more, Like take an area that you haven't really paid much attention to and say, okay, let me figure out more about this first. And then maybe a solve will come from that. Or you've got to clip something out and let it go. It's hard to figure out which of those two things you need to do. And the most insidious thing is that if you get it wrong, you're going to stay stuck until you figure out the right option and do that one instead. So
still going to be tangled.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just laughing at Johnny too, because the situation that we've gotten into with the Monsters Playbook is so large with the amount of characters we have and some of the deep conversations that we've had that have just kind of branched off. It becomes a lot to deal with, and it's almost a group activity to keep everything connected.
It really is. The biggest thing that I'm always worried about is what I kind of think of as the giant eagles problem, where when you have certain things in the world and then again, months or years later, you have a threat and you're like, well, wait a minute, that secret organization was out there. Why wouldn't they have stopped this? Like, oh, right. Shit. And the truth is, because I thought it would be more interesting if you have to stop it. But like when there's that many things floating around, there can be uncomfortable questions that you've made the world smarter than yourself. But honestly, my biggest thing is when I'm thinking about world building in terms of having big underlying mysteries of the world that are eventually uncovered, making the finding of that not feel like I'm deflating the balloon. Because the most interesting thing in a game about solving mysteries is having a mystery to solve, and how making sure that once you find the answer is good enough that it doesn't make it just be like, oh, so it's just a guy.
Yeah.
That classic just a guy pitfall that you can fall into as a writer.
He's not just a guy if you start sewing on hands. I'm just saying.
It's just a guy
He's
with
just a
two
guy
hands.
with 15 hands.
Real solutioning.
Just add hands if you get stuck. I love it.
In a world where people have buckets of hands, is not having two hands a rebellious act?
Well, no, because oh, wow. So you've taken a different way. You're thinking the hands help you catch the leak. I'm thinking you have a bucket and it's full of hands because there are hands leaking from your ceiling. And that's like a problem I have never had, but now I kind of want to have. It'd be fun for a time.
That's very Junji Ito.
Yeah.
I was thinking of a bucket of hands that never emptied, like a limitless water supply, but with hands. So it's clearly the flood of hands coming from the limitless bucket.
Sorry, John, this episode is now entitled The Bucket of Hands.
I'm only now realizing that you've all added a D on the end of this, and I was just picturing a bucket of Hans Christian Andersen just hanging out.
Improv, baby.
When you guys first started talking about this, I thought you guys said hams, and so I was thinking like,
boy.
I was like, what? Bucket of hams? All right.
My enunciation is not my strong suit. I apologize in advance.
I think John is being deliberately obtuse.
When developing a world, does visualizing it enhance or hinder the player experience? Like, that could be just like visually describing how something is, or are you drawing out maps and showing people, like, how have you guys navigated that? Does it help or hinder?
I would say it depends, and sometimes the answer is not always clear. As someone who, in a recent episode, tried to describe the layout of a structure as church-like, and then went down a 5-minute rabbit hole with my players of them naming different parts of a church. Sometimes it's not great, because this was not a church. But other times, or Johnny, I think, was the one who said, it's like this but X. It's like X but Y. Can be an easy way for your players and also the audience, again, if you're doing something recorded, to understand something quickly. It's a stapler the size of a German Shepherd. Like, you can visualize that. It's a wishy-washy answer, but like it depends on what you're trying to describe. Obstinate and contrarian your players are feeling in the moment.
I think half and half, because painting a picture with words is the best, and it really helps both audience and players get in not just like the mood that I'm trying to set, but also like to see the board in their minds so that they can come up with different things to smash into each other to see what will work. But what I love most about games and the actual play genre as an audio medium is that you can describe stuff that's impossible to see or make. Like butting up against the ineffable, Quinn Absurdia obviously is full of this, that like it's stuff that can't exist, doesn't exist, and shouldn't exist. And describing just enough of it to kind of get you and your imagination going in the right direction, and then just letting you run with it. Because what you will come up with that is going to be scary to you or interesting to you is probably more interesting than what I would say otherwise. It's a horror thing. Mm-hmm. There's a Stephen King quote, I think, from the essay Danse Macabre, maybe, where he's talking about how when there's a sound behind a door and you open it and it's a 5-foot bug, your first instinct to react is actually relief, because you're like, oh, well, it could have been a 50-foot bug. So in that case, actually describing the thing will deflate the balloon.
Your imagination is always scarier.
See, this question confused me because I was like, do they mean supplying visual reference? Because again, this is a game. I think visuals are a great tool, but I stand corrected because my answer was I can't imagine a scenario where it would hurt a player's experience to have more context for what you're trying to describe. And 5 minutes of church architecture discussion sounds like the fastest way to pull attention out of a scene I've ever heard.
Episode 29. Tune in.
But yeah, like so maybe that's just like the cautionary tale is like don't let the visuals or trying to paint a word picture trip you up if you're getting tongue-tied or, just need to say, oh, it's like this thing. Use a simile and move on.
Love that.
Yeah. Concrete details, whether they be in the form of like actual pictures or maps or layouts or any of that, can be really helpful, particularly if your players need to feel grounded in the space in order to take particular actions. Obviously, a lot of the storytelling that we've been talking about here is more narrative focused, which means it's much more about what the players are doing and how they are feeling and how things are moving around them than it is about the concrete physical space that they are currently embodying. But there are some games that are more about that concrete physical space. And for those especially, it can be very helpful to have visual reference for what that space is like. I think the equivalent for the more narrative space is how quickly or how effectively can you define the emotions that a place gives you? And like that's where we get to comparing it to something else, because like I have feelings about a German Shepherd. I have feelings about a stapler. When I hear a stapler the size of a German Shepherd, I have different feelings now. And I think that is like one tool in your tool belt for giving you that immediate like visceral response, is to bring in something you already have emotional ties to and present it in a way that ties to the scene you're trying to describe. But sometimes you got to say, yeah, they're 30 feet away from you. So like, no, you can't punch them. Like,
yep.
Yes. So there's a balance.
There's one more aspect of this that I want to touch on, because there's a moment, Quinn, in I think the finale of Monster Hour, where like there's a moment where like a spear comes in, and because of the way you've described that spear, everybody knows whose spear it is.
Yeah.
And what that means. So it's like, it's that thing of like, there's a detail about the person or a detail about some equipment or a detail about a place that you can then just by describing it physically, now that's going to connect back to something that you've talked about before.
And that's a cool, one of the best parts of world building. We've talked about, trying to world build by, comparing things to other things or visualization. But the best part of world building is when, you can say one thing, and because of the world building that you and your players have done, they know instantly what it means, even if it's just like one word or one small detail. Right. And that's rad. Like that's great.
Even radder, when your players say something to you as the GM and you go, oh no. And they go, does that do what I think it does, Natalie? And you go, oh no.
Yep.
Check and mate.
My players, for example, are deeply suspicious of anything that is the color gray.
Is there such a thing as a world becoming too big?
For this question, I just have yes.
I would say there. This is something that we I don't remember who alluded to this earlier, but a world where like it doesn't feel lived in. Like you can create such a sprawling world, and this happens if you do, I think, too much world building without your players, or like in advance of a session 0 or session 1 or whatever. You can create like this big world that doesn't feel lived in. that nobody lives in. And like that's a bummer, because you actually start playing the game and your players walk around and their characters walk around and things just feel hollow. The other type of world building I think can happen is where a world can get too big,
just like contextually.
Yeah, just like the world expands too fast compared to kind of where you're at in playing. But I mean, the nice part about that is the solution is just to get in there and play. And like Natalie said, take a section and just live in it for a little bit. Like you and your players just play around in that space, take one of those strings and follow it. And then, you can kind of build that world out, and then it's not too big anymore. But yes, a world can be too big.
It becomes like choice paralysis too, when there's too many different like places to go, or we've definitely come up against it in some of our, like when a big fight is coming and the players are like, okay, well, I want to call this person and get them on our side. And I also want to call this organization, have them show up. And then I also want to call this guy. And it's like, you could also just play though.
Yeah, boy, I did make all of those people and organizations, didn't I?
And the bad guy here is scary enough that I would want to call them all too.
Yeah, I think if you spend too much time developing a world, you run the risk of never actually doing anything with it. And this is true for just like writing in general, not just writing for tabletop and actual play. I wish I could remember the article, but I remember someone out there saying that world building is the junk food of writing. Basically meaning it's fun, but it has no substance and it will not sustain you. And I agree with that to a point. I think it's necessary, and you can get away with a very small amount, which is true of any junk food. But you should get to have fun with like the boundless spontaneity of coming up with ideas. But then if what you have when you're done is useless unless you then use it, and you need characters, you need motivation, you need conflict, you need a backdrop for a compelling story. If you only know how to write the setting, but you haven't spent the time to figure out how to include conflict and resolution, then you're not going to have the like satisfying feeling of, and now I have eaten of my narrative fill, There's like all those books that say how the world of Star Wars is built, and no one would ever buy those books unless there were fans who loved the story part of it enough to say, well, I do want to know what the flux capacitor and the Millennium Falcon looks like. So if you ask them, the name of the iconic ship, they'll tell you the one that had characters living in it and interacting with it versus, the one in the background that some studio artist was like, I got to put something in the scene. Here's an egg carton that I've turned into a shipping crater. Like,
yes.
I do think perhaps the premise of this very episode might do a listener the disservice of thinking that world building is something you do apart from the story. But sorry, I said earlier there's only one thing to take away, and that's that you're always unprepared. Second thing to take away, please take this away. World building only needs to be big enough to support your story. World building is absolutely in service to the narrative, not the other way around. If you've built the world extensively and now you're like spoiled for choice for ideas for like what kind of story you want to tell inside of it, that's cool, that's great. Pick one and then like narrow the focus, because I think world building is too big when you've lost the plot. That's when world building's gotten too big, because like now you have too many things in play and your story has become too broad by usually accident. I actually think this is a problem that, like, for instance, the Marvel franchise has right now for their cinematic universe, where everything has to be multiversal threat now because they did that one time, and now everything has to do that. And they've kind of like lost the ability to focus back in on a smaller,
interesting story.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's like a perfect example of the world building got so big that now you can't, it makes it so hard to tell those tighter tales.
So, I mean, to that point, everything like it, well, actually just all the points we've been saying, like it is okay to build a world that is fairly large depending on your story and where you want to go with it, but really kind of focus in on the plot of it and kind of the first touch point for your characters and just kind of the game in general. Keep that very focused until it's needed, and then bring in those other ideas later versus having it all up front.
Yeah, to go back to your question about general versus specific, I think the answer there is something to do with breadth and depth. that you want to have a sort of breadth of knowledge about like the kinds of people who live in places and the kinds of vibes you get at this place and the kind of world you got. But I think as you start to play and you start to figure out what is actually interesting to your players, yourself, and your story, to go in depth on some of those things so that you can still get the junk food of like sitting there and being like, I'm writing and writing and writing and coming up with all this stuff. But instead of going really wide, go really deep on the things that are actually a part of your world and a part of your story. That said, I think we're kind of tripping into your next question here, John.
Well, I had one more thing to say. World building is sometimes like the unsung hero of the work that we're doing, right? Where, like you were saying with the MCU, they build everything out so much that then the little character that maybe in a movie that was slightly tighter, you would like want to know more about. In the movies where it's gotten so big, you just don't care about those side characters anymore because you know there's nothing behind them other than a fancy CGI facade or a quippy one-liner, you know? And it can happen when you're a player too, honestly. To like shift this over to them for a second and away from like the GM audience. For the pirate series that we worked on, I was super excited about playing a pirate, and I went and did a bunch of research about ships, and I learned a bunch of nautical terms, and I designed a diagram of the ship we were going to sail on, and I could tell you how you'd get from that mast over to that part of the lower decks and all this stuff. And it was maybe 20 minutes into the first session where I was like, we're never going to do this. This is never going to be anything other than something that helps me get into character and feel grounded in the world. But not a single person, especially not my GM, shout out to Zoe, is going to care how many cargo holds we had or the number of cannons that were facing a certain direction on the ship. It was all very like, for the most part, extraneous fluff that would never see the light of day because it didn't matter for the story that was being told.
Whom amongst us has not over-researched a topic for world building that never got used? I spent like a couple hours reading about mine infrastructure for an early arc of Monster Hour. Nothing. Didn't matter. Irrelevant. I could have said it looked anyway.
We'll move on to the next question. Could you share any valuable tips, tricks, or tools for aspiring world builders? Are there any pitfalls they should avoid? And I feel like we've talked about some of them already with world building in general.
So I want to just really quickly put a magazine-y bow on the anything you should avoid, which I would say don't fall into what I call the show Bible trap, where I've seen a lot of artists on Tumblr, for example, who like they're planning a webcomic or something and they're doing like full character turnarounds and style sheets and all this stuff like they're going to turn it over to a writer's room or something, and thinking that you can't really get started until you have this bulletproof amount of stuff. And we've been saying it this whole time, but the whole thing is playing is the process. This is how writing actually works. That will be the archaeologist's brush that will get to those details, whether they're there already or whether you find them in the moment. Natalie said it directly earlier. Don't let feeling unprepared stop you from just starting. And one trick that I did find very useful and have found useful in every time I've tried to build any kind of a city is the, you guys might have done this as well. It is the SPERM is the acronym.
Okay.
And it is, you are to consider the social, political, economic, religious, and military structure of your society. So that is just that's like a good checklist to be like, if you're bringing your people to a city that you're making up, cities tend to have those 5 things, and it's easy to remember because the word is sperm.
I was going to say, I don't think that's going to leave my mind. I will have trouble remembering that acronym, but we'll get there.
Welcome to my nightmare.
Natalie, you said you had like read over the questions and written out answers earlier. We've polluted the waters in so many ways during this discussion, so I want to know what your original answer to this question was, like what you were thinking.
Well, I said, I don't think there's anything you can call a trick. There's no easy thing that's going to guarantee you find success with your world building because, or even your writing, unless you stick with it. It's like what Jonny was saying, the process is playing. And if that is a solo thing for you as a writer and the play is the process of writing, and not getting anything that you really want to latch onto, and then finally having something click, and then that's the like spark of joy. Then like that's the play of the writing process and the world building process. Then the work's not done. You have to keep going from there. Not a trick, but a tool, I would say, if you want to avoid like inherent bias and systemic racism elements that you might not be aware of in fantasy tropes and things like that. I would say listen to Three Black Halflings. They're great, and they talk about this stuff all the time on their show. They break down guests and articles, and they have people come on and talk about those things, so that if one, you're doing it for public consumption and it's a piece of art you're putting out in the world, you can be careful of those pitfalls and like check your own biases and privileges. But then even for your own games, if you want to make sure that your home game or your private game is going to be fostering that kind of energy, so it becomes an ingrained world building muscle memory, then I would suggest that. You can look up James Mendez Hodes. He does a lot of really good stuff. He's a sensitivity consultant and a writer. And then there's the Tumblr blog called Writing with Color. And they have lots of articles that are really helpful for if you're thinking to yourself, is this a harmful stereotype? You can look up and make sure that, if it is, you should change it. And if it's not, then maybe also look at like what things you might want to avoid or try to subvert, or even figure out if it's your story to tell, because that's also, becoming a thing we should recognize in what we're doing.
I was going to echo Natalie and say I think we've talked about the pitfalls pretty extensively at this point. Tips and tricks, aside from the bucket of hands, there's no one thing that's really going to like deliver a good world for you or for your players. The one, you can call it a trick or whatever, that I like is if the rules of your setting are flexible enough to allow it, or if your players sort of understand the systems of magic or systems of physics and reality, let them co-create the world. If they ask you a question like, where could I find, X? Where could I find a dwarf with the knowledge of, arcane hammersmithing? Or where can I find, a German Shepherd sized stapler? Whatever it is, turn it back on them. Say, well, okay, let's, where do you think? What location is it? What's the name of, the pub that you want to meet up with your contact at? Which, in addition to kind of lessening your load as the GM, also is great because, you have more brain power, more ideas, more perspectives coming in, but you also get the buy-in of your players. They help get to create the world in a sense. And like, that's really cool. That's a great way to play the game, whatever the game is, if you can do that.
The hilarious thing is, Natalie, you started it by saying like, there aren't really any tricks. And then Quinn kind of reiterated that and said like, but, there's certain, it can help to put it back on the players. And my answer is actually that no, there is a trick. Here's the dirty secret to world building. And that is do half the work, not all the work. And to specifically expanding on what Quinn said, there's I can't consider it anything but a trick that I learned from running Brindlewood Bay for the first time, which is a game by the Gauntlet, Jason Cordova, and there's an element to that is carried over in other Carved from Brindlewood games that is called paint the scene questions. And what makes these, I think, distinct from just normal reflecting back to your players to help you flesh something out is paint the scene questions are what you get most commonly if you enter a new place that is like an established place for this mystery. Let's say, like for instance, Bitter Rivals, which is one that I wrote for our podcast. It is about a school mascot that gets like brutally murdered. And then you have to figure out like what happened to them and whether or not the person is okay. Cause like it was just the costume that was found. Like where did the guy go? And like all this stuff. Right. And so if you go to that teacher's classroom, his name is Rob Kestrel. If you go to Rob Kestrel's classroom, the first time you enter there, I ask the paint the scene question. That's something along the lines of, what do you see in this room that indicates that Rob was living more here than at home? And that's what I mean by going halfway. I am giving a leading prompt. I'm helping the players focus their energies. I'm giving them a topic. There is something in this space that tells you that Rob is living more here than at his house. That is like a very specific category of world building to add. And then by asking that question and then however the players fill that out, now suddenly those things are in this space and might affect how this scene goes. Or we might call back to it when we get time to theorize for this mystery or that sort of thing. So I think paint the scene questions and like similar varieties of those sorts of leading questions are like the GM world builder's secret weapon is like you just decide one part of the detail and then tell them to expand on that. And now it's easier for them, it's easier for you. The world gets more minds involved, which leads to a more interesting product. So yeah, that's my secret trick.
I'm stealing that. That's going right in my bucket of hands.
They're so good.
Yeah. If the title of this episode isn't Bucket of Hands.
I was just talking to somebody yesterday about like things that I've taken from some games and like stolen and brought to others. And ever since I started using paint the scene questions, it's made its way into every game that I run because they're so helpful. And sometimes you're like, oh yeah, I know the answer to this. And other times you're like, well, like it's definitely got this sort of vibe, but I don't know, you tell me more about it. What's going on here? Players are always more invested if they've helped to build it. So
I was going to say the interest level goes up too between all the players because totally.
And you don't even have to wait to do that until a session, right? Like not quite to that degree of like, tell me these things and they will become true. But I ask my players all the time when I'm like building out a section or a mystery or an arc of a story. And I say, what do you think this NPC would feel about this? Or do you think they'd be there? What would that be like? And I just throw things out there because I said it in the safety tools episode that there's no spoiler worth hurting your players. There's also no spoiler that like, if you're clever about how you ask them about it, will actually ruin their fun, even if you tell them what you're thinking of doing. Really, the people you constantly want to ask for ideas about the story you're telling together, if you're careful and make sure that you're not going to like, reveal the end, but you can reveal the setup. They know you're going to make a story for them. So what does it matter if they know that like at some point they're going to see this face again, or that at some point you're thinking of throwing this kind of challenge at them? It's like, okay, well, the point is to figure out how they solve that or what they do when they interact with that character again, not, keeping it secret that they show up, at least in my mind. I'd rather collaborate on that element of things so that the parts I'm really excited about, the really spicy little details that I say, and then this, and they all freak out. That's the stuff you keep close to the chest. But everything else, there's no reason to not share it. It's a thing you do a lot in 7th Sea, actually, where there's literally a mechanic built in where the players are writing the story with you. And to a degree, it creates sort of a meta knowledge of like, oh, this thing's coming. But as long as you're vague about it and you have a good table of players who are not going to abuse that knowledge, it actually works really well to just create that interconnected feeling and the moments of like, oh, but then, and that means, oh my gosh, kind of excitement at the table.
Throughout all those moments and things like that, what was the most rewarding experience you've had while building a world?
I have two answers to that.
I was going to say, it could be before you invoke the players or during the actual play.
I think the funniest moment I've had as a conversation of world building was when one of our players, Miah, had sort of invented that there is sort of a magical mafia. And she was asking me a lot of questions about the structure of it and like, who are the people? What are the players? How many families? How far does it go? How old? How does it work? Where do they all live? And then I didn't really have very many good answers. And then cut to, she started running her own game that had a similar sort of magical order. She messaged me and was like, oh, I get why you didn't have all those answers. It's like, they don't matter yet, so I'm not worried about it. And then she was like, I get how you don't want to worry about it until they start mattering. So that was funny. But I think the most rewarding was when I sort of blinked and looked up and realized that I had written like 4 songs about our games, that like I had accidentally become so involved that I sort of had like a musical style I broke into song about it that like there was enough going on that I could pluck out scenes and take out individual emotions and turn them into a totally separate piece of art. So that was a really rewarding moment.
I have 2 quick ones, I think. In terms of when once you've built the world and gotten the players involved, I think the most rewarding thing is like being able to build something like structure, like create something over time and like weave things together, towards a big reveal. Whether like, and I completely agree with what Natalie was saying earlier. Like, I think it's almost better if you talk about it, if you hint at it, because there's so much that goes into a big reveal of like timing and things like that. In season 1 of Monster Hour, like very early on, we established that one of the main characters has like a lost relative. And like, I talked to the player about that. It was, a known thing, but like their appearance, like the timing of that, the timing really like has such a big impact. And when you build a world and you create all of the relationships and all of the stakes and everything through play, and then deliver on that moment, the reaction, a great reaction from your players, like that's the best as far as I'm concerned. The other, I would say, thing that I think is really great and really rewarding about world building that I really enjoy is taking my players' throwaway lines and making them real. I do this all the time in season 2 in Monster Hour, but season 1, you know, very early on, one of the players was joking, saying, you know, well, the real monster is social media. We'll have to fight Facebook. And Arc 3 made that a reality. I don't want to spoil it, but, you know, taking something that's just like kind of a joke and then putting that in your bucket of hands and making that part of your world building, like that's also deeply rewarding, you know, because it takes something your players, you know, thought was a joke and then you turn it around and say, nope, it's in the world now. Thank you for that hand.
Something I'm really liking about the bucket of hands metaphor is it's like it visually is interesting, right? Like it hits you. You know
that's your adjective.
It's interesting. It's visually interesting. It's hard to forget. Let's put it that way. But then we talked about like a lot of these details. This bucket of hands is really just details you can insert to complicate something, to make it more your own. And those hands might not be your own. In fact, they probably aren't your own.
Just you
putting them on makes it novel, right? So they are hooks. There are things to grab. Like you said that earlier, Jonny, and you like to supply things that are hooks for your players, things for them to grab onto. I'm just saying that's what the bucket of hands is there for. Hands do two things, you know? They grab things and they can hook onto you.
They're hooks that grab back.
Yeah, exactly. And
hands,
I think that's
the hooks that grab back.
But that's so true.
Nature's
Again, t-shirt right there.
Thank you for coming to David's TED Talk.
Look here. I did not start here with this. Again, once again, we have become the metaphor for world building, wherein we started in one place with some sort of
real time
seed idea, and it has evolved to where we are now. Along those lines, I think one of my favorite world building bits is when... Oh, actually, okay, I'm going to step back to frame up world building as one of two classes primarily. One is a gardening approach, where you plant very specific things, and you have the little card next to it that says this is a tomato, this is a corn, this is one spinach, right? You've got like all of that in your garden, and you know what's going to grow, and you water it, you feed it appropriately, and it grows what you set out to grow. That's one approach to world building. My approach is to go to a back alley and like get a bag of seed from some strange fellow I've never met before, and then go to my backyard and just kind of toss it and then spray water at it once a day, and then like start see what's growing, and then like maybe plant a trellis here because this one seems kind of like it's growing somewhere, and maybe if I give it a little bit more, it'll get a little taller, you know? And it's sort of like micro adjustments of an otherwise natural ecosystem. So with that in mind, I view early game world building very much as planting really interesting seeds or throwing out really interesting breadcrumbs that I might not even like have an end goal for. It's just like a thought or a scene or a sound or something that is like super evocative to me of some kind of emotion. And so I plant that, and people go, wow, this is weird. This is curious. I'm intrigued. And then they hold on to that. And then I have like, you know, some amount of time between myself and what I can kind of sense the players are saying, you know, talking about, to then make that grow into something really cool, to garden it to the point that it becomes something that feels intentional, even if it never was.
Really, it's just making a very interesting outline that like things that you're bringing to the table, just, you know, listing those items, but not necessarily fleshing those out until the players start getting close to
It's the same idea of, you know, don't build out your entire mafia until everyone is looking into the mafia. At that point, maybe it's time to start building your mafia, right? But like planting the seed that there is a mafia, that's an awesome seed, right? Like that's like that's going to get your players thinking. And this is like for specific story time, but I feel like I've already spent too much time talking about the architecture of the story. But in a game that I have, this is my super long, we're almost done at here, the 4th year of this D&D game that I've been running. I planted this seed very early on of this idea of this group of people who are working on behalf of the goddess of fate. And it's like super asynchronous. Like this is not like particularly an organization, although they do interoperate, and there's no like specific focus. They're just off like kind of trying to do various things. And so I planted that, and they met like a member of it or whatever. And then we had other things to do. But then the players like never forgot about these people or like their role in the world. Over the course of 4 years, like at every turn, every time we've gotten to a new part of the arc, they've been like, oh, like, well, how do we tie this in with this person who we know? Or how do we bring these people back in? Because they seemed like they would know about this. And like now the entire circle of these people are showing up for the final boss fight that we're in now. And like, it feels like such a culmination of the player's experiences. And it's all because of that strategy of like, this is cool and interesting. If they latch onto it, then I'm going to start watering this. And then being able to like, you know, pull the fruit off the tree at the end is very satisfying.
For me, like the satisfying aspects of world building are a lot of times, like I said before, the things that don't end up mattering, because like that's feeding a different part of my brain and creativity than the part that gets to use what comes out of that, the fruit you were talking about, David. Like, yeah, all that gardening and the seed planting and the fruit, and then you take that fruit and you chop it up and you serve them a fruit salad of like story and drama and tension. And so to pull it back to the example I gave with the ship, like I went to a sailing ship. There's the Constitution in Massachusetts. And we just went and looked at it and got like fully immersed in figuring out like, what would it feel like to stand on one of these things? Oh my gosh, that's really high up and, you know, to climb just the first level of the mast. Wow, geez. Like, so that sort of like pre-game play, that like play in the research, I think is some of the stuff that's like really satisfying for me. I was writing for a LARP at one point, very, very beginnings of it, right? They were just developing the world. The players didn't know what they were going to be yet. We had like nothing released yet other than the outline of some continents in the world, like a map of continents. And I took these shapes and said, okay, let's learn about how a planet works. And Devin Rue, who has a wonderful series of map making lessons that work in geology and weather patterns and current patterns. And then there's also there's a YouTube channel. I'll get it so you can link it, John. But that also goes into the science of how climate affects biome. And so I spent probably 3 weeks coming up with the ocean currents, the weather patterns, the like natural way the land masses would be covered in desert and forest and tundra and plains and all this stuff. And then I submitted it to like the other people on the board for this LARP, and they were like, yeah, whatever. And I was just like, but don't you see? It all works now. It's perfect. And they're like, but what if people want to do something else in that region that's not desert based? I'm like, that's what magic's for. Now magic can break the rules I've made and make everything more interesting. Isn't that wonderful? And they did not agree, but it's fine because I had that fun. It fed me for that experience. And I think like that's just sometimes how it goes. Sometimes you just eat, a really unhealthy dessert, but you loved it and you'll always remember that, experience, even if it makes you feel terrible later on. But to bring it up, to not end on a down note, the other thing I really love is when all the pieces, all the fruit, all the hands, buckets, whatever you want to call them, all these details that exist in your world, and if it's kind of happens only when you've been playing for at least a small stretch of time at least, and you hit that point where we talked about before, the barrier, the wall, the thing where you're like, well, I want something to happen here, but I don't know what it is. And you sit and you think and you cut something out, you remove it, you expand, you figure things, out more in a certain area you hadn't explored before. And eventually you hit that point where stuff you've already done, like puzzle pieces, falls into place and the narrative is just there. And you just look at it and go, how did my brain do that? Oh my God.
Yep.
Incredible. Like, I can't wait for my players to see how this all fit together, because they'll instantly know, because they also have this understanding of all the disparate pieces that are out there. And then, that moment of just like the narrative sprouting out of the work that you've done as a world building or as a writer. That's the best feeling. It's even better when you do it with other people. So shout out to Johnny and Kyle and Zoe and Quinn and David and everybody else who I sometimes ping for ideas when I'm like, hey, do you want to collaborate on the thing we do before the collaborative storytelling? Because that's even more fun.
Yeah, but I mean, I can attest to that, like just being part of the games that we play for the Monsters Playbook and stuff, when things do fall together in, that pattern, it's like everyone's just kind of taken back by it. It's like, whoa, And I think, Jonny, you've echoed this before, but this game is smarter than me.
Yeah, that's the term for it in our game is profile mode, when I will be in the game and something will happen or a player will suggest something and I go, wait, and I turn to the left for some reason. And then because that's where pieces fall together. And it is right. Like, wait, that does make sense with everything that's been going on. And it's both a completely original idea that has taken us all by surprise, and it is also completely inevitable.
We play digitally, so we call it hanging on for dear life. Grip the edges of your camera screen. Buckle up.
Oh, man. Through all of this, if you guys could offer one piece of advice to novice world builders, what would it be?
Oh, I've got this one right off the dome. This is my most valuable, apart from the hand metaphor, which is now my most valuable piece of advice. Here's the one thing to take away. Here's my third one thing to take away, which is don't take it too seriously. My absolute, like, when I still think of like my pinnacle of world building that I've done, I actually talked about this on the last book club I was in, but I based a group of like families of important families in this world off of different fast food chains. And like they were themed very directly, in my opinion, very overtly around these different fast food chains. And it took my players like over a year to accidentally realize that was the case. They're like, the Silvers family, yeah, like what's the head of their family called, Long John or something? And me, like, totally serious, yes. They are. And that's when they're like, wait, so then is this? And I'm like, yes, that family is themed after McDonald's. That's correct. Yeah. And everybody like slowly realized that this entire time, this world that they'd been taking, approaching from a very serious perspective, because these are like very serious forces at work here. We're all based on this very, very dumb joke. And that's what I mean. Like, anything can become serious. So don't take your world building too seriously. Like, if an idea you find funny might also serve the greater purpose of this narrative you're trying to say, then do it. And as long as you take it, sorry, I don't want to reverse course there. As long as you treat it seriously, but don't take it seriously, then you're in a good place. That's my poorly worded, but at the heart, good advice.
Once again, David, you've said something that has completely flipped the prepared answer I had for the question. Because I had written down, oh, well, you might never feel like you're making your best stuff. But in this case, I mean, hey, if there's anything, I know when I peaked and it was in the past, and that's okay. It's okay to always be going downhill from there. But no, on a more serious note, to take it serious,
yeah,
you just have to keep doing it. If you're writing something and you're like, this isn't my best arc or whatever, it doesn't matter. Just keep going. Again, don't let it get in your way. And it's one of those things where direct experience is the only thing that's going to help you learn way more than any amount of advice or tutorials or, explanations from other people on the internet, including ourselves. You just have to be brave and trust yourself and your players and do it.
I'm going to cheat and do two small ones because that's kind of how I roll. One, take breaks, to Natalie's point. Just take breaks. I can't tell you how many times I've hit my head against like a world building problem for hours on end and come back 3 days later and it just all falls into place. And then the other one is, if you do find yourself with a thorny world building problem that you can't solve and, you have a session, don't be afraid to not have everything figured out. Don't be afraid to, get a bag of weird seeds from someone in a back alley and scatter them and see what grows. Or if you have a half-tended garden.
Maybe it'll be hands.
Yeah, maybe it'll be hands.
Fresh hands from the garden. You want those over store-bought,
Hand farm.
Yeah, always better than store-bought.
Ethically sourced garden hands.
Don't be afraid to, come in with a half-built world and build it with your players as you're playing.
Yeah, I think the pithy thing that I wrote is just that it is supposed to be fun. This is a cool, neat hobby that we all do. It should be fun to do. And if it's not fun, try something else. I think David has said it a couple of times. The only reason you need a world is for people to play in it. So if you think you have enough to start playing, the best thing to do is to start playing.
All right. Before we wrap things up, I just want to give our amazing panelists a chance to do a quick shout out to their own podcasts. So folks, take a moment, and let our listeners where they can find you for more awesome content. Let's start with David.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Once again, I am David Easley. I host a show called Trials of the Apocalypse. It's a podcast that plays different Powered by the Apocalypse games in search of an interesting short story. We are currently on hiatus, but if you haven't listened to us before, then you have so much to catch up on. We've got 8. I think we've been through 8 at this point. We've played Apocalypse World, Undying, Ghost Lines, Brindlewood Bay, Monster of the Week, The Watch, Pig Smoke, and The Between Ghosts of El Paso. We've covered a gamut of fun genres. We sometimes are funny, sometimes are serious. We always pursue the unexpected. That's my kindness to my cast. We've got a wide group of voices who participate in it. I think so far we've had 15 distinct people engage with the show, which is pretty wild. Oh, and we've recently started doing live content at Trials Live on YouTube. I say that we've struggled mightily to do live content. We've had some technical difficulties. We've had some health issues, but we hope to do some more of that later this year. So if you're reading this in the future, check it out and see if we've posted anything, and hopefully we have.
Thanks so much for having me. Again, this was a really great discussion. I love hearing how other folks approach world building, and a lot of good advice here. I'm Quinn. I am the GM and producer of Monster Hour. We are a narrative-driven actual play podcast. We played Monster of the Week in our first season, which is complete, some 60-odd episodes, and we are currently playing Absurdia, just like a Welcome to Night Vale-esque PBTA game. We're having a lot of fun with it. We've got a wonderful cast of characters, and we have a lot of fun when they attempt to take things off the rails, and I take their jokes seriously, and we play out and see what happens. So you can find us pretty much anywhere, social media at Monster Hour Pod, or just use Google. You can find us. You know where to look. You're smart.
Again, thanks for having me. This was so much fun, and I'm so glad I got to listen to all these brains talk about the thing we all do. I'm stealing everything we said. It's great. I'm from the Storyteller Squad, where I play the Keeper, as well as my DMPC, Don't At Me, Aiden Brightwood. And you can find us. We are a Monster of the Week campaign for now. Who knows what we'll do when that story's done, but we have at least 2 more seasons and 2 kind of on the books already. If you're listening to this a little later than when it's released, you'll probably see that we have recap episodes coming out for our 1st and 2nd seasons. So if backlog intimidates you, we're going to be doing that going forward for all of our previous episodes so that people can catch up quickly and then maybe fall in love and go back and listen to the other episodes, because that's always good for the algorithm. We are online, thestorytellersquad.com, and you can find us on socials at Story Squad Cast. We are the lo-fi queer slice of life meets high fantasy cryptids of actual play shows. And that's going to be true no matter what game we're playing.
It's possibly the best tagline ever.
Thank you. Case in point, if you want, you can go over to the Writers Room also. You can find them at Writers Room 7th, where my cast and I have done a sort of long-form collaboration, and we play a bunch of magical, queer, and unfairly attractive pirates in a little 13-episode miniseries over there. I've guested on other shows and things like that, and you can find us all on the internet. We tag each other all the time. Thanks for having me, and we'll see you out there, adventurers.
All right. And then lastly, Jonny, you want to go?
You're already listening to my show.
Cut the episode. That's it.
Outro music plays.
Yeah, you get it. We're Monsters Playbook, monstersplaybook.com. Our cover story campaign is in the middle of our 3rd season, which will be the final season of that campaign, and then we will find out what will happen after that. In the meantime, we also have a lot of backlog you can hang out with, or more great, fun, educational roundtables just like this in our series that we call Book Club.
That concludes our episode. A big thank you to David, Quinn, Natalie, and Jonny for their for your guys' valuable participation. We sincerely appreciate your time, and of course, big thank you goes out to our dedicated listeners for joining us on this exciting episode of Book Club in a World. Your support means the world to us. Until next time.
Bye, everyone. Bucket of hands. Amazon, $39.99.
Hands in, everyone.
Store-bought is fine, but homegrown is better.
This has been Book Club in a World, presented by the Monsters Playbook. A big thank you to David from Trials of the Apocalypse, Natalie from the Storyteller Squad, Quinn from Monster Hour, and our favorite keeper, Jonny. You can find all of our guest shows and information in this episode's show notes, along with any notable resources mentioned in this episode. The Monsters Playbook is produced and engineered by Miah Wander, edited by Miah Wander and Lauren Johnson. Our theme song is by Jonny Grubb. If you like this episode, please tell a friend. We love friends. You can find the Monsters Playbook on the social media channel of your choice. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Tumblr. You can even hang out with us on our Discord. And if you like what we're doing, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We'll see you next week with a brand new episode of The Cover Story, where as always, we'll have some good news and some bad news. Thanks for listening.